The Long Voyage by Charles Dickens, published in 1853, read by Ryan Velasco. This work was published before January 1st, 1923, and is in the public domain worldwide because the author died at least 100 years ago. When the wind is blowing and the sleet or rain is driving against the dark windows, I love to sit by the fire, thinking of what I have read in books of voyage and travel. Such books have had a strong fascination for my mind from my earliest childhood, and I wonder it should have come to pass that I never would have round the world, never have been shipwrecked, ice environed, tomahawked, or eaten. Sitting on my ruddy hearth in the twilight of New Year's Eve, I find incidents of travel rise around me from all the latitudes and longitudes of the globe. They observe no order or sequence, but appear and vanish at will. Come like shadows, so depart. Columbus, alone upon the sea with his disaffected crew, looked over the wastes of water from his high station on the poop of his ship, and sees the first uncertain glimmer of the light, rising and falling with the waves, like a torch in the bark of some fisherman, which is the shining star of a new world. Bruce is caged in Abyssinia, surrounded by the gory horrors which shall often startle him out of his sleep at home when years have passed away. Franklin, come to the end of his unhappy overland journey, would that it had been his last, lies perishing of hunger with his brave companions, each emaciated figure stretched upon its miserable bed without the power to rise, all dividing the weary days between their prayers, their remembrances, and the dear ones at home, and conversation on the pleasures of eating, the last named topic being ever present to them. Likewise, in their dreams, all the African travelers, wayworn, solitary, and sad, submit themselves again to drunken, murderous, man-selling despots of the lowest order of humanity, and Mungo Park, fainting under a tree and succored by a woman, gratefully remembers how his good Samaritan has always come to him in woman's shape, the wide world over. A shadow on the wall in which my mind's eye can discern some traces of a rocky sea coast recalls to me a fearful story of travel derived from that unpromising narrator of such stories, a parliamentary blue book. A convict is its chief figure, and this man escapes with other prisoners from a penal settlement. It is an island, and they seize a boat and get to the mainland. Their way is by a rugged and precipitous seashore, and they have no earthly hope of ultimate escape, for the party of soldiers dispatched by an easier course to cut them off must inevitably arrive at their distant bourne long before them, and retake them if by any hazard they survive the horrors of the way. Famine, as they all must have foreseen, besets them early in their course. Some of the party die and are eaten, some are murdered by the rest and eaten. This one awful creature eats his fill and sustains his strength, and lives on to be recaptured and taken back. The unrelatable experiences through which he has passed has been so tremendous that he is not hanged as he might be, but goes back to his old chain gang work. A little time and he tempts one other prisoner away, seizes another boat, and flies once more. Necessarily in the old hopeless direction, for he can take no other. He is soon cut off, and met by the pursuing party face to face upon the beach. He is alone. In his former journey he acquired an inappeasable relish for his dreadful food. He urged the new man away, expressly to kill him and eat him. In the pockets on one side of his coarse convict dress are portions of the man's body, on which he is regaling. In the pockets on the other side is an untouched store of salted pork, stolen before he left the island, for which he has no appetite. He is taken back, and he is hanged. But I shall never see that sea beach on the wall or in the fire without him, solitary monster, eating as he prowls along, while the sea rages and rises at him. Captain Bligg, a worse man to be entrusted with arbitrary powers there could scarcely be. He is handed over the side of the Bounty and turned adrift on the wide ocean in an open boat, by order of Fletcher Christian, one of his officers, at this very minute. Another flash of my fire, and Thursday October Christian, 25 years of age, son of the dead, and gone Fletcher by a savage mother, leaps aboard His Majesty's ship Britain, hove to off Pitcairn's Island, says his simple grace before eating, in good English, and knows that a pretty little animal on board is called a dog, because in his childhood he has heard of such strange creatures from his father and the other mutineers, grown grey under the shade of the breadfruit trees, speaking of their lost country far away. See the Halswell, East Indiaman, outward bound, driving madly on a January night towards the rocks near Seacombe, on the island of Purbeck. The captain's 2 dear daughters are aboard, and 5 other ladies. The ship has been driving many hours, has 7 feet water in her hold, and her main mast has been cut away. The description of her loss, familiar to me from my early boyhood, seems to be read aloud as she rushes to her destiny. About 2 in the morning of Friday the 6th of January, the ship still driving and approaching very fast to the shore, Mr. Henry Meriton, the second mate, went again into the cuddy, where the captain then was. Another conversation taking place, Captain Pierce expressed extreme anxiety for the preservation of his beloved daughters, and earnestly asked the officer if he could devise any method of saving them. On his answering with great concern that he feared would be impossible, but that their only chance would be to wait for morning, the captain lifted up his hands in silent and distressful ejaculation. At this dreadful moment the ship struck with such violence as to dash the heads of those standing in the cuddy against the deck above them, and the shock was accompanied by a shriek of horror that burst at one instant from every quarter of the ship. Many of the seamen, who had been remarkably inattentive and remiss in their duties during the great part of the storm, now poured upon deck, where no exertions of the officers could keep them, while their assistance might have been useful. They had actually skulked in their hammocks, leaving the working of the pumps and other necessary labors to the officers of the ship, and the soldiers, who had made uncommon exertions. Roused by a sense of their danger, the same seamen at this moment, in frantic exclamations, demanded of heaven and their fellow sufferers that succour which their own efforts, timely made, might possibly have procured. The ship continued to beat on the rocks, and soon bilging, fell with her broadside towards the shore. When she struck, a number of the men climbed up the ensign staff, under an apprehension of her immediately going to pieces. Mr. Merton, at this crisis, offered to these unhappy beings the best advice which could be given. He recommended that all should come to the side of the ship lying lowest on the rocks, and singly to take the opportunities which might then offer of escaping to the shore. Having thus provided to the utmost of his power for the safety of the desponding crew, he returned to the roundhouse, where, by this time, all the passengers and most of the officers had assembled. The latter were employed in offering consolation to the unfortunate ladies, and, with unparalleled magnanimity, suffering their compassion for the fair and amiable companions of their misfortunes to prevail over the sense of their own danger. In this charitable work of comfort, Mr. Meriton now joined, by assurances of his opinion, that the ship would hold together till the morning, when all would be safe. Captain Pierce, observing one of the young gentlemen loud in his exclamations of terror, and frequently cry that the ship was parting, cheerfully bid him be quiet, remarking that though the ship should go to pieces, he would not, but would be safe enough. It is difficult to convey a correct idea of the scene of this deplorable catastrophe, without describing the place where it happened. The Hales well struck on the rocks at the part of the shore where the cliff is of vast height, and rises almost perpendicular from its base, but at this particular spot, the roof of the cliff is excavated into a cavern of 10 or 12 yards in depth, and of breadth equal to the length of a large ship. The sides of the cavern are so neatly upright as to be extremely difficult to access, and the bottom is strewed with sharp and uneven rocks, which seem, by some convulsion of the earth, to have been detached from its roof. The ship lay with her broadside opposite to the mouth of this cavern, with her whole length stretched almost from side to side of it, but when she struck, it was too dark for the unfortunate persons on board to discover the real magnitude of the danger and the extreme horror of such a situation. In addition to the company already in the roundhouse, they had admitted 3 black women and 2 soldiers' wives, who, with the husband of one of them, had been allowed to come in, though the seamen, who had tumultuously demanded entrance to get the lights, had been opposed and kept out by Mr. Rogers and Mr. Brymer, the 3rd and 5th mates. The numbers there were, therefore, now increased to nearly 50. Captain Pierce sat on a chair, a cot, or some other movable, with a daughter on each side, whom he alternately pressed to his affectionate breast. The rest of the melancholy assembly were seated on the deck, which was strewed with musical instruments and the wreck of furniture and other articles. Here also Mr. Meriton, after having cut several wax candles in pieces, and stuck them up in various parts of the roundhouse, and lighted up all the glass lanthorns he could find, took his seat, intending to wait the approach of dawn, and then assist the partners of his dangers to escape. But observing that the poor ladies appeared parched and exhausted, he brought a basket of oranges, and prevailed on some of them to refresh themselves by sucking a little of the juice. At this time they were all tolerably composed, except Miss Mansell, who was in hysteric fits on the floor of the deck of the roundhouse. But on Mr. Meriton's return to the company, he perceived a considerable alteration in the appearance of the ship. The sides were visibly giving way, the decks seemed to be lifting, and he discovered other strong indications that she could not hold much longer together. On this account he attempted to go forward to look out, but immediately saw that the ship had separated in the middle, and that the forepart, having changed its position, lay rather further out towards the sea. In such an emergency, when the next moment might plunge him into eternity, he determined to seize the present opportunity, and follow the example of the crew and the soldiers, who were now quitting the ship in numbers, and making their way to the shore, though quite ignorant of its nature and description. Among other expedients, the ensign's staff had been unshipped, and attempted to be laid between the ship's side and some of the rocks, but without success, for it snapped asunder before it reached them. However, by the light of a lanthorn which a seaman handled through the skylight of the roundhouse to the deck, Mr. Meriton discovered a spar which appeared to be laid from the ship's side to the rocks, and on this spar he resolved to attempt his escape. Accordingly, lying down upon it, he thrust himself forward. However, he soon found that it had no communication with the rock. He reached the end of it, and then slipped off, receiving a very violent bruise in his fall, and before he could recover his legs, he was washed off by the surge. He now supported himself by swimming, until a returning wave dashed him against the back part of the cavern. Here he laid hold of a small projection in the rock, but was so much benumbed that he was on the point of quitting it, when a seaman, who had already gained a footing, extended his hand and assisted him until he could secure himself a little on the rock, from which he clambered on a shelf still higher, and out of the reach of the surf. Mr. Rogers, the third mate, remained with the captain and the unfortunate ladies and their companions nearly 20 minutes after Mr. Meriton had quitted the ship. Soon after the latter left the roundhouse, the captain asked what was become of him, to which Mr. Rogers replied that he was gone on deck to see what could be done. After this, a heavy sea breaking over the ship, the ladies exclaimed, "Oh, poor Meriton! He is drowned! Had he stayed with us he would have been safe." And they all, particularly Miss Mary Pierce, expressed great concern at the apprehension of his loss. The sea was now breaking in at the forepart of the ship, and reached as far as the mainmast. Captain Pierce gave Mr. Rogers a nod, and they took a lamp and went together into the stern galley, where, after viewing the rocks for some time, Captain Pierce asked Mr. Rogers if he thought there was any possibility of saving the girls, to which he replied, he feared there was none, for they could only discover the black face of the perpendicular rock, and not the cavern which afforded shelter to those who escaped. They then returned to the roundhouse, where Mr. Rogers hung up the lamp, and Captain Pierce sat down between his two daughters. The sea continued to break in very fast. Mr. MacManus, a midshipman, and Mr. Schultz, a passenger, asked Mr. Rogers what they could do to escape. "Follow me," he replied, and they all went into the stern galley, and from thence to the upper quarter galley on the poop. While there, a very heavy sea fell on board, and the roundhouse gave way. Mr. Rogers heard the ladies shriek at intervals, as if the water reached them, the noise of the sea at other times drowning their voices. Mr. Brimer had followed him to the poop, where they remained together about 5 minutes, when, on the breaking of this heavy sea, they jointly seized a hen coop. The same wave which proved fatal to some of those below carried him and his companion to the rock, on which they were violently dashed and miserably bruised. Here on the rock were 27 men, but it now being low water, and as they were convinced that on the flowing of the tide all must be washed off, many attempted to get to the back or the sides of the cavern, beyond the reach of the returning sea. Scarcely more than 6. Besides, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Brimer succeeded. Mr. Rogers, on gaining this station, was so nearly exhausted that had his exertions been protracted only a few minutes longer, he must have sunk under them. He was now prevented from joining Mr. Meriton by at least 20 men between them, none of whom could move, without the imminent peril of his life. They found that a very considerable number of the crew, seamen and soldiers, had some petty officers, were in the same situation as themselves, though many who had reached the rocks below perished in attempting to ascend. They could yet discern some part of the ship, and in their dreary station solaced themselves with the hopes of its remaining entire until daybreak, for, in the midst of their own distress, the sufferings of the females on board affected them with the most poignant anguish, and every sea that broke inspired them with terror for their safety. But, alas, their apprehensions were too soon realized. Within a very few minutes of the time that Mr. Rogers gained the rock, an universal shriek, which long vibrated in their ears, in which the voices of female distress was lamentably distinguished, announced a dreadful catastrophe. In a few moments all was hushed, except the roaring of the winds and the dashing of the waves. The wreck was buried in the deep, and not an atom of it was ever afterwards seen. The most beautiful and affecting incident I know, associated with a shipwreck, succeeds this dismal story for a winter night. The Grassman, East Indiaman, homeward bound, goes ashore on the coast of Caffraria. It is resolved that the officers, passengers, and crew, in number 135 souls, shall endeavor to penetrate on foot, across trackless deserts, infested by wild beasts and cruel savages, to the Dutch settlements at the Cape of Good Hope. With this forlorn object before them, they finally separate into two parties, never more to meet on earth. There is a solitary child among the passengers, a little boy of 7 years old who has no relation there, and when the first party is moving away, he cries after some member of it who has been kind to him. The crying of a child might be supposed to be a little thing to men in such great extremity, but it touches them, and he is immediately taken into that detachment. From which time forth, this child is sublimely made a sacred charge. He is pushed, on a little raft, across broad rivers by the swimming sailors. They carry him by turns through the deep sand and long grass, he patiently walking at all other times. They share with him such putrid fish as they find to eat. They lie down and wait for him when the rough carpenter, who becomes his especial friend, lags behind. Beset by lions and tigers, by savages, by thirst, by hunger, by death in a crowd of ghastly shapes, they never, O Father of all mankind, thy name be blessed for it, forget this child. The captain stops exhausted, and his faithful coxswain goes back and is seen to sit down by his side, and neither of the two shall be any more beheld until the great last day, but as the rest go on for their lives, they take the child with them. The carpenter dies of poisonous berries eaten in starvation, and the steward, succeeding to the command of the party, succeeds to the sacred guardianship of the child. God knows all he does for the poor baby, how he cheerfully carries him in his arms when he himself is weak and ill, how he feeds him when he himself is gripe with want, how he folds his ragged jacket around him, lays his little worn face with a woman's tenderness upon his sunburnt breast, soothes him in his sufferings, sings to him as he limps along, unmindful of his own parched and bleeding feet. Divided for a few days from the rest, they dig a grave in the sand and bury their good friend the cooper, these two companions alone in the wilderness, and then the time comes when they both are ill, and beg their wretched partners in despair, reduced and few in number now, to wait by them one day. They wait by them one day, they wait by them 2 days. On the morning of the third, they move very softly about, in making their preparations for the resumption of their journey, for the child is sleeping by the fire, and it is agreed with one consent that he shall not be disturbed until the last moment. The moment comes, the fire is dying, and the child is dead. His faithful friend, the steward, lingers but a while behind him. His grief is great, he staggers on for a few days, lies down in the desert, and dies. But he shall be reunited in his immortal spirit, who can doubt it, with the child, when he and the poor carpenter shall be raised up with the words, Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, ye have done it unto me. As I recall the dispersal and disappearance of nearly all the participators in this once famous shipwreck, a mere handful being recovered at last, and the legends that were long afterwards revived from time to time among the English officers at the Cape, of a white woman with an infant, said to have been seen weeping outside a savage hut far in the interior, who was whisperingly associated with the remembrance of the missing ladies saved from the wrecked vessel, and who was often sought, but never found. Thoughts of another kind of travel came into my mind. Thoughts of a voyager unexpectedly summoned from home, who traveled a vast distance, and could never return. Thoughts of this unhappy wayfarer in the depths of his sorrow, in the bitterness of his anguish, in the helplessness of his self-reproach, in the desperation of his desire to set right what he had left wrong, and do what he had left undone. For there were many, many things he had neglected, little matters while he was at home and surrounded by them, but things of mighty moment when he was at an immeasurable distance. There were many, many blessings that he had inadequately felt. There were many trivial injuries that he had not forgiven. There was love that he had but poorly returned. There was friendship that he too lightly prized. There were a million kind words that he might have spoken, a million kind looks that he might have given, uncountable slight easy deeds in which he might have been most truly great and good. Oh, for a day, he would exclaim, for but one day to make amends. But the sun never shone upon the happy day, and out of his remote captivity he never came. Why does this traveller's fate obscure, on New Year's Eve, the other histories of travellers with which my mind was filled but now, and cast a solemn shadow over me? Must I one day make his journey? Even so, who shall say that I may not then be tortured by such late regrets, that I may not then look from my exile on my empty place and undone work? I stand upon the seashore, where the waves are years. They break and fall, and I may little heed them, but with every wave the sea is rising, and I know that it will float me on this traveller's voyage at last.